Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today we have the Illiad. Yeah, this big boy right here. So this is one of the cornerstones of Western literature and literature in general. One of the oldest stories overwritten by Homer, the Greek. So the Iliad actually means the Song of Ilium, and Ilium being another word for the city of Troy. And I think it's what the Trojans actually called Troy, while the Greeks called it Troy, but they called it Ilium. I think that was it. Anyway, this is a very thick book and a very wordy book. And as I understand it, this originally was a story, an oral history, and kind of more of a play. So apparently it's more pleasurable to actually hear it read than to read it. Kind of like Shakespeare, I would say. But anyway, how is the book itself? It is... It's not easy to read, but it is very interesting. My first fire impression is that this is the original action story. You have Achilles, who is the main character. He's the best soldier in the army, but there is beef. They sack a city, and King Agamemnon, he basically is like, he takes, I think, one of the girls who is the daughter of the priest, or one of the priests of the gods. And so I think there's bad luck, or there's a premonition of bad luck. And so an old man tells the king, hey, you might want to give this girl back and some of this treasure back to the temple so the gods don't curse you. So he's like, okay, I'll do that, but I'm really selfish and angry, so I'm going to take Achilles' stuff. Achilles is really pissed off. Because you did a bad decision, I have to pay for it. So, it's basically every Office Space ever. And so what Achilles does is that when the big battle comes up to actually fight with the Trojans, Achilles refuses to fight. And that's a lot of the first opening part of the book. And it's like, how do you resolve this? How do you do whatever? And, the whole, it's almost tropey, like the whole... because like, yeah, I could kill all of them, but I'm not going to, man. And he has this cousin, Patroclus, anyway. And so he there's this whole moment where like he goes out into battle because everyone's demoralized because because Achilles is not only a superb fighter, but he leads the Achaeans, who are the best fighters. These are like the U.S. Marines, or you have the army, but you have the special super guys. And so he leads the best soldiers in the army, and because he's pissed off, he's not going to go fight. He's going to, do this. And then there's this whole meta narrative where the gods have intended for all of this to happen. They are going to harden Achilles' heart because King Agamemnon did do wrong in their sight. And then of course there is, sides taken where, Zeus and some of the gods want the Trojans to win, and the other gods want the Achaeans to win. And so they're kind of deciding, well, what should happen? And so you have this dialogue with the gods, and sometimes the gods come down and interfere. And so, for example, Achilles is descended, apparently, from the gods. One of his parents was. And so what happens is sometimes the gods will come down and talk to him, and I think it's Athena that actually comes down. And what's actually very interesting is that it says when Athena talks, her eyes glow. And I just thought of like the glowing eyes meme. And so glowing eyes meme, like 10,000 BC or whatever, whenever this was written. So it's very, very old. Or, this was written 1000 BC, I believe. So back to Patroclus, he has this whole thing where the morale of the men is low because Achilles isn't fighting with them. So Patroclus, because he looks very similar to Achilles, dresses up, wears a helmet that looks like Achilles, but it's actually him in disguise. And he goes into battle, and everyone's super motivated to fight the Trojans. But then he gets killed, and it finds out it's not Achilles. And when Achilles finds out that he went out and did this heroic thing and died for him, he gets pissed off. He's like, okay, now I'm angry. But it's the classic scene where it's like the heroes best friend dies and the buddy action cop movie, like, no, my best friend, oh, that's it. Now it's serious. So there's so many funny modern tropes that you can drive. Like, this is an action movie. It's so funny and cool. Speaking of which, I would totally recommend the movie Troy from 2004 with Brad Pitt. It's not exactly a one-to-one of this, obviously, but it's a good movie. There's a lot of cool things I'm talking about, but to actually read it is very different. It's like the first chapter, it's setting everything up. The second chapter, it's all about representing all the ships and all the armies. So it goes on and on and on about, oh, there were 500 ships led by this guy, and then there were 200 ships led by this guy. And of course, you can't forget these guys, and there's the Spartans and the Cretans and the blah, 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 blah. So it tries to give you this size of this massive army. And for more context, it's like where Troy is basically Turkey, modern day Turkey, and the Greeks have sailed all the way over here to this place, this plains of Troy, to have this final battle and siege the city. And the whole backstory is that this war has been going on for 10 years. And what actually started it, or what was the final straw, the Spartan queen, Helen, is seduced by Paris. And Paris is one of the sons of the king of Troy, and he brings Helen back with her. And so that is the last straw for the king of Sparta, who is Menelaus. So Menelaus, who they say is a red-bearded warrior, joins forces with Agamemnon and Achilles and the rest of the Greeks who go out to do this big battle. You know, a lot of people say, like, is the Iliad isn't a promotion of violence and warfare of the ancient world? Yes and no. It's a really strange mix, because it'll talk about the great, you know, brass and armor and the spears glintering in the sun and the great soldiers standing together ready to do battle and to drive a spear through the enemy's gullet or whatever. But then it says when someone does die, it kind of has like a slow motion you know, backstory where suddenly it's like, oh, and you know, an arrow was shot and pierced the chest of brave Palaiologos, and by the way, this guy, he lived in these plains and he had 20 sheep and 50 cows and a beautiful wife and 2 children, and the great sorrow that fell upon the soldiers as he crumbled to the ground and his great body became as motionless as the dust, and the great eternal darkness came over his eyes. So it's like, it's very emotional. It's like, yeah, these are a bunch of cool guys, but then someone dies and it's the worst thing ever. And they all mourn him, and they all have, after the battle, they have funerals for each of these guys, and they, you know, they put them on pyres. So it's a very, you know, I guess it's very realistic. Like, guys like to do war, but it's also very sad, and there's a lot of emotions. And it says the men are crying over their fallen comrades. So it's a very, you know, I would say almost realistic in a way, but it feels very much like an epic. And that does lead into the fact that, you know, a lot of people say that, scholars say that this is a work of fiction entirely, and that this never happened. I find that very difficult to believe, because it talks about very specific people and places, and, you know, I mean, history back then, it was a very oral thing, and I imagine that for a long time, I think the reasonable thing to assume is that this was a real battle that did take place. But in order to, you know, as you retell oral history, you were doing it orally. So you kind of need to, you know, spice it up a little bit. So I think while this is based on a real battle, there is a lot of mythological elements in it. And, you know, it talks about the gods and, you know, maybe like the power, that the grace they grant Achilles, but there's nothing really mythological that intercedes into the actual fighting itself. It's not like the gods come down and shoot lightning bolts. And there is a part where the most fantastical thing that happens is that Achilles is delivered a shield and a set of armor and a great spear that's forged by Hephaestus, the great god of the overworld, and he has this like almost superpower, like he's powered up and he's glowing and he's fighting. But that can all be given to exaggeration. It's not like there are griffins on the battlefield or weird mythical creatures. It's still very much based on a bunch of guys just fighting each other. So it's like mythological history. It's like, yeah, this really happened, but it is a little bit embellished, obviously. It has characters and plots and, I mean, hey, got to make it entertaining. But to say that it's entirely a work of fiction, I just don't believe it. It's just such and it's real enough for it to be believable. And of course you have the antagonist, which is, Hector and Priam, king of Troy. And so so after much fighting and whatever, we come kind of the conclusion of the book. And it's very interesting because the question or the assumption that we have is that the Trojan horse is in the Iliad. It's actually not. What's interesting is that this book stops right before that. And I find that very, very interesting because the Trojan horse is such an iconic thing, but it's also kind of slightly mythological. A bunch of guys getting inside a giant wooden horse, but that actually work in warfare. And this is kind of the part where we get a line blurred between history and reality. And the thing that's very interesting about the Trojan horse that is mentioned in the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is the same book with all of the mythological creatures in it. So I think this is my personal speculation, but I believe this book was based on a real battle, an actual battle. It had, it personified characters and embellished things a little bit, but I think it was a very real thing that happened. And then the Odyssey seemed to be more of the, people love this story and this battle so much. They're like, well, what happened next? And I feel like the Odyssey is almost like the fantastical sequel, the mythological story that comes afterwards. That this normal battle got so popular, they kind of go, well, what happened next? What happened after? Because the way this book actually ends, like 3,000 years old, spoilers, Achilles wins and kills Hector. And so the last chapter of the book is, very interestingly, it's the king of Troy, King Priam, disguises himself as a beggar and sneaks all the way into the Achaean camp and goes to Achilles personally and says, please, please, can I at least bury my son's body? And seeing this old man, pleading for his son's body to bury it properly, kind of brings Achilles to tears, and he's very emotional. He kind of has the full burden of what he's done upon him. And so Achilles eventually, even though they have the king of the enemy nation right there, Achilles says, yes, I will let you go and we will give your son's body back. And so they allow them to have a 10-day funeral ceremony, basically, for his son. And so there's kind of weird forgiveness in the heart of this war and this battle. So I'm not sure there's a direct moral there or something, or a story about forgiveness, but that's what happens. And it ends at the funeral of Hector. So the whole thing about the Trojan horse, Achilles getting killed in the heel, and the ending of Troy, that is not in here at all. It's actually all in the Odyssey. So you can see how someone would be like, okay, well, that's cool, but how did it end? That's all the factual information, but how does it actually end? And I could see like Homer being like, oh, well, if we're going to kind of, fill in the blanks and whatever, we might as well fill it in with a bunch of fantastical stuff. And that's where the Odyssey comes in. Perhaps the first official sequel in all history comes in is the Odyssey, which is a sequel to this, which focuses on the story of Odysseus. So that is basically the Illiad, one of the first books ever written of a epic poem about a great war and the gods and a warrior. Now, I sounded very enthusiastic while saying all that. However, this is a very long book. It is not easy to read. I'll be honest with you. As much as this is a very important piece of literature, It would be better, I think, honestly, to listen to an audiobook of this rather than actually read it, because it is so onerous. Definitely worth something to at least get a brief understanding of it. Always keep reading. All right, bye.